We are 16 days away from the upcoming bar exam, a little more than 2 weeks. I know that many of you are studying hard and may want to have a quick break just to watch this particular message and kind of reconnect a little bit. You undoubtedly have a lot going on this close to the exam, and you may feel like it's all on your shoulders. Everything has to happen based on the work that you do and how much you put into it and how hard you study and how much you learn and how diligent you are. And all of those things are true. They certainly will vary by individual, but this is a time when working hard is part of the equation. And it's also a time when doubt and certainly some fear and frustration seep in. In church this morning, I was thinking a little bit about that. I didn't understand the music that they were playing, so I just drifted off, which I tend to do. But I was thinking back, and I'm not sure particularly what made me think about this story, but one of my favorite stories from the Bible is the story of Gideon. Now, before some of you get all freaked out and say, oh no, he's going to preach, nothing even remotely like that. But it's a life story. And like many great stories in the Bible, it's got application whether you're a believer or not. The story of Gideon, very briefly, is from the Old Testament, the days before Israel becomes a nation. Israelites are being beat up pretty badly by some invaders, big guys, scary guys. We'll just call them the scary big guys. And this is a time when God speaks directly to his people. I happen to think he still does that, but at least in the Bible, we get the sense that God is actually talking to people. And God is looking for a leader. He's looking for somebody to step up to the bar, if you will. So where does he go? Does he go to Harvard Law School or Yale Law School or Stanford? Does he look at the people who are on law review? The answer is no. For some strange reason, he goes to what would, I guess, today be the equivalent of a correspondence law school. And not only does he not go to the top of the class at the correspondence law school, and he goes to the guy who's the bottom of the class. And this guy's name is Gideon. Gideon is really just scraping by. He is the lowest of the low in his family. He's out there tending the sheep. And not only that, Gideon is just a blow-off. He's a punk, doesn't really care, and he's scared of everything. And that might remind you of some of the people that you knew from law school or maybe even in your legal practice these days. And God says to Gideon, as I suppose only God can, look, Gideon, I got a big job for you, and you're the man for the job. Now, Gideon, and this is why I know Gideon had to have been the precursor of a lawyer, Gideon says, yeah, I need some signs. I need you to prove to me that you're really God and that this is really what you want me to do, which I think is spoken exactly the way a lawyer would do it. I certainly know that when I talk to my students, very often they say to me, oh yeah, how do I know this will work? Okay, fine, whatever. So I'm not God and I just give up. But God, being God, says, okay, give me your test. And so Gideon gives him a couple of tests. You've probably heard of one of them. It's called putting out the fleece, which is you put out this thing that's supposed to get wet at night and everything around it gets wet, but the fleece stays dry. And so God does that. And Gideon, in pure law school style, says, I might have been mistaken about that fleece thing. Maybe we'll do it the other way around. Maybe this time you'll make it wet and everything else dry. And God says, okay, fine, whatever you want, man. We'll do it. Set up the test. So Gideon sets up the second test, and sure enough, it comes out just the way it's supposed to. And Gideon now is trapped. He realizes that this is much like that moment when the professor is called on you in a Socratic dialogue and you aren't prepared and you have to stand up and recite and you don't have any idea what the case was. And so Gideon says, okay, you got me. What do you want me to do? God says, good, I'm glad you're with me. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to go raise an army to go fight the big, bad, scary guys. And Gideon's, oh man, this is really not my thing, God. I'm not really the army fighting kind of guy. And God says, I'm God, you're not. Okay, fine, Gideon says, I'll go raise an army. So Gideon, in the way that all type A personalities do it, goes out and he doesn't just get an army. He raises an army of 30,000 men. Now, I got to tell you, back in those days, 30,000 men is enough to fill up the big scenes with all those Mel Gibson movies. And 30,000 men, the way they fought battles apparently back then is you take your 30,000 men and their 20,000 men and you go run at each other on this big wide open plain and whoever's wins, which makes a lot more sense to me than some of the things we do these days. But in any event, Gideon's got his army of 30,000 men. In effect, he says, you know what? I'm going to buy every bar review course I can get. I'm going to study everything. I'm going to make flashcards, and then I'll do the course a second time. And I think even maybe I'll do it a third time, and I'll write answers to all of the questions. This is industrious. This is good. And Gideon comes back to God, and he says, look, aren't you impressed? 30,000 men. I'm doing pretty good. God says, I think you're overdoing it, Gideon. I think what we got to do is cut this army down a little bit. Gideon said, what, are you kidding me? I'm going to lose. If I do less, I'm going to lose. If I do less, I'm going to fail. God says, I think that's too many. So why don't you just tell everybody that doesn't want to be fighting this war that they can go home. Gideon's at this point pretty well convinced that he's going to have to do the "I'm not God and you are" routine again. And so he says, okay, fine, I'll do it your way. So he goes out to the 30,000 men, and however you speak to 30,000 men in the days of pre-amplification. And he says, look, any of you that don't want to fight this battle, that, the big scary guys are not your personal enemies, it's okay. You can go home. And I have this picture of everybody standing there. And then finally one slacker says, hey, that's for me. I'm out of here. And the slacker starts to run. And as soon as the first guy moves, everybody else moves. Well, amazingly enough, of the 30,000 men, 20,000 turn around and run. They leave. And that feels a lot like what starts to happen when you study for the exam. You've got all your tools assembled, you got everything, and then you say, oh, maybe this is not right. And now you get freaked out and you start to run. And the emotions are pretty scary. And now instead of having everything and all of the material, you realize that given the time, you just can't do it all. And so now instead of having 3 times through the course, you've only been able to do it 1.5 times. So there's Gideon with his 10,000 men, and he turns to God and he says, okay, you satisfied now, 10,000 men? And God, being God, says, no, 10,000 is still too many. And Gideon says, this can't be happening to me. What do you want now? And God says, why don't you take them down to the river and see how they gather water for themselves when they've marched down to the river? And Gideon says, this is an interesting test, God, but okay, we'll walk down to the river. So he marches his men down to the river. And he says, okay, at the river, you can now stop and get water. And God says, watch how they get the water. And some of the men reach down and start throwing the water on themselves. They're exhausted and hot. This is the desert. And they're careless and sloppy, and they go crazy, and they're starting to throw water around and basically having a water fight. And then there are a few men that just kneel down on one knee and they cup the water to their lips. They just do this. They're always up and looking. They're alert. They're aware of what's going on around them. Now, there are bar takers who are totally immersed right now. They have poured water over themselves, over everyone around them. They are so deeply into the deal that they don't have any idea that today is Sunday or what month of the year or who they are or anything else. And then there are a few people that are really focused. They're thinking about what's going on around them, and they see where they are in context of what's happening. And these warriors who are in context saw what was going on. And God says to Gideon, okay, the ones that kneeled down on one knee and just cupped the water and kept their eyes open, you keep them. Send everybody else home. But God, that's going to leave me with very few men. And he says, do it. So Gideon says, those of you that are doused in water, you go home. Now the 10,000 men have come down to just 300. Gideon looks at God and he says, God, come on. I got 300 men and the big scary guys, they've got thousands. And you got to be kidding me. We're not really going into battle. What are you doing? And here's the punchline. God says, you're going to win this battle. But you're going to win the battle because I'm with you, not because you had more men, not because you were bigger, not because you were faster or smarter. If you had gone into battle with 10,000 men and won, you would have said it's because of what you did. If you'd gone into battle with 30,000 men and you'd won, you would have said it's because of what you did. But if you go into battle with just 300 men and you win that battle, you're going to know that it had nothing to do with you. It's about me. And that's interesting, isn't it, if you're a bar taker right now? If you've been thinking to yourself that this is all about you, it's all about what you do, it's all about what you can make happen, it's about how much you can learn, how much you can cram into your brain, it's all about you, I think you're missing the boat. See, I don't think it really matters at this moment if you believe in God or not. I think God believes in you. And I think that the reality here is that this is bigger than just you and bigger than what you can do on your own. That's why you got help. If you're in our course, I suspect that the hand of God may have had something to do with that. But no matter where you are and what you're doing, I think you need to respect the fact that this might be something you can't do entirely on your own. And in fact, I would suggest to you that being a wise and caring member of our profession is probably something you can't do on your own. And so there comes a point in this process where I think you have to say, I'm going to do everything I can do on my own, but I'm also going to give this up to something bigger than me. And if you call that something bigger God, I think that's great. But if you call it a bigger force of nature, that's okay too. But recognize that maybe it's more than just what you can do on your own for the next 16 or 17 days. The people over the years that I've seen that succeed in the bar, the people at this stage that are able to get the bigger picture, that are able to step back and say, I'm going to work hard, I'm going to be prepared, I'm going to be ready. But I recognize that this is not entirely up to me. It's not up to the bar examiners. It's not up to my bar review course or my mentor. It's not up to my friends or my boss or my family. It's about my doing the best I can do and trusting that there's a plan for my life, and that the bar review and the bar exam is part of that plan. And then accepting, I think, with calmness, that's something you probably can't affect a whole lot by working harder or doing more. I'm not suggesting that you stop studying right now or that you do a whole lot less. I'm just asking that you do it with some perspective, that you recognize the possibility that there's a higher force working, and that if you trust some of this to that higher force, to the God of your understanding, that you're going to be a whole lot happier and a whole lot calmer and a whole lot more at peace with yourself, not only for the next couple of weeks, but as you go through the test. So how did it work out for Gideon? He took his 300 men and he went down to the camp where the big bad scary guys were at night, as God had told him to do. And he told them to take lights and to encase them inside of these ceramic pots so that they couldn't be seen. His 300 men circled around the camp of the bad guys, and they were quiet, and there was no light. And then, on a command from Gideon, as God had told him to do, he broke open all of the lights at once, and they started making these wild shouting sounds and blowing horn. The big bad scary guys in their camp were so frightened, they were so startled by what had happened, that they jumped up and they thought that their tent mates were their enemies all of a sudden, and they started fighting each other. And in fact, they killed each other off. Gideon triumphed with 300 men, and not a single one of those warriors was injured or died in that battle. That's pretty remarkable, isn't it? And Gideon went on to become what was called a judge, one of the first leaders of Israel. If you listen to someone who's wiser, if you take advice and you do what you're told to do, and you do it in faith and trust, amazing things can happen. I'll leave it to you to decide how that should happen for you in the next couple of weeks. But I would invite you to think long and hard about the story of Gideon. Now, there's a lot of Gideon in all of us. And frankly, I've found that when people step aside, get out of the way, and say, okay, God, this is your deal, not mine, and trust that process, they do a whole lot better on this exam. Funny how that works. A God thing or a Gideon thing. Hopefully, it's something for you to think about. Have a great study day.